To be honest, I'll be surprised if I don't change the channel. USA is not very good at soccer, but maybe even that's more interesting than the presidential debate.
I think you just insulted us again. This New Zealander stuff is starting to get to me.
The problem is, Paul, they're having the Euro and the American Cup at the same time. And if you watch like Spain play Portugal or something, or France, Netherlands, and then you switch it over to America versus Panama or something, it's not a fair comparison.
Panama's a tough team. I'm just going to put that out there. So, all right.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right. Well, I'd like to welcome both Bob Robb with us today, the columnist. You can find Bob on Substack. Bob has been an Arizona Republic columnist for a number of years. He was considered to be a conservative. I think he is, although who knows what the hell a conservative is anymore. And then Henry is a professor at ASU. He's put a big focus on authoritarians. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. He's also writing a new book, so I'm going to ask him some questions on that. Henry also has a baby, Arthur, in his house today. How's baby Arthur today, Henry?
He's napping, which is good. So if the baby is napping, then everyone is happy. That's best thing.
Yeah, I get it. You might even get through the podcast. So
exactly.
So today we are going to talk about the American apocalypse. All right. Now, I'm not talking about the general election that's coming up. I'm talking about there are 3 writers who wrote very long pieces about the American apocalypse. And we're going to try to cover all of those. But because we're recording on Thursday and tonight is the debate between President Biden and President Trump, it is worthwhile, I think, for us to ask just a couple of questions on it. And here's the first question I'd like to ask both of you. And again, remember, our audience won't see this until it's done. What's the issue that you hope you see from both of them? If you were being aspirational and wanting to hear something from them, what would it be?
How to fix the finances of the federal government, which both of them will avoid like the plague. So I'm not expecting anything useful to a swing voter in terms of issue or direction for the country. I think it's primarily a debate about Biden and whether he calms some of the anxiety as to whether, given his age, he's up to the job. I think that's practically the only real issue in the debate.
Because I knew that Bob was going to say the deficit, I couldn't say the deficit, even though I might have. So I'm going to say America's place in the world. I think this is a big issue that's looming. Trump has kind of neo-isolationist tendencies. Biden doesn't really seem to quite know what to do with American power abroad. He wants to oppose authoritarians sometimes, but not always. And so I think it would be good to see them discuss this, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I completely agree with Bob. I think the debate is basically about people waiting to see whether there's some sort of massive gaffe from either of them. And I think there'll be a lot of personal attacks. I think that Biden will call Trump a convicted felon. I think that Trump will then go after Biden's son, Hunter. And I'm not optimistic about an actual debate about any issues.
We spent one of our sessions together talking about what I call first principles in politics. Everybody likes to talk about first principles in business. What's the one thing that you can count on when you peel back the skin of the onion, that once you can count on it, you have a basic truth that you can build upon? I think one of the mistakes that voters make is that they pick a candidate and then they pick their issues from that candidate, as opposed to the other way around. The first one's about feeling. How do I feel about these two people? But I think it is of value to us as Americans to think about what are the things that drive us. You hit 2 of the issues that I know matter to me. One of my top issue is definitely the deficit. I'm worried about us long term. I think our government is too big; it's spending too much, and the deficit that's left over in the middle by not funding it at an appropriate level puts us at risk. The other one is, what's the role that we should be playing as Americans? I do think that the question that I guess I'll ask next is, what do you expect out of them? Now, my own personal opinion is, I'm going to take a little different stance than you did, Henry. I think the expectation is that we have one guy who's mentally decrepit and that doesn't have the cognitive function to be able to be president, and the other guy is a psychopath who we have no way to be able to predict what he's going to do. But I've been listening to what both of them are talking about. I think this debate's not going to be what we expect. In fact, I think both candidates are actually going to do better than we think. I think Trump is going to be on better behavior than he has been in the past. I mean, many of us saw the debate in 2020, the first one where he was, I don't know what that was, but it was kind of like following around behind him and doing all types of very weird things. I don't think Trump's going to do that this time. I think he's going to try to be more focused and more disciplined. And I think Biden is going to be more focused on talking about issues. But let's talk about what our expectations are. Those are mine. Bob, your expectations from the debate.
I don't share those, unfortunately. I think Trump's character is built into him, and the few times in 2016 that he tried to roll it back and be presidential were utter failures and didn't last long. I think he will be Trump. Biden has risen to public occasions. His State of the Union addresses have been strong and firm. And I think he's going to be more concerned with his own presentation than driving home specific issues against Trump. To the extent he does that, I think you have abortion and the alleged threat to democracy that a re-election of Donald Trump would represent. I think he will try to play those themes, but from his standpoint, I think presentation is 90% of the job.
I kind of agree with both of you in a way. I think that Trump is going to be more controlled. For how long, I don't know, because he had these bad experiences in debates in the past. I also think that Biden is going to be very fixated on his demeanor, his presentation. But I guess what I'll then be waiting for are the deviations from what will be the plan, right? I mean, they both will have their plan and their hopes, like a Grand Slam tennis player goes into the tennis match wanting to play a certain style of tennis, and the question is whether they can do it. That's what I'll be waiting for, is to see, okay, we're going to have a certain set of expectations and a demeanor at the outset, perhaps, and the plan, and then what happens then? How do they deviate in unexpected ways from that? And that, I think, is going to be decisive for the course of the debate, because I really think they're going to be both quite risk averse in this debate and feel they have a lot to lose.
So I was asked a question on a hike this morning. Is there anything that either candidate could say that would change my mind? As I stated on the past, I am not a fan really of either of these two candidates. I'm one of those people who I don't like either one. I think that they're neither one the right person for the job that we need them to do, but I do think we're probably going to have to select between them. When I answered that question, I focused more on Trump than I did Biden, to be fair. I'm going to give you my answer, and I'd like to hear the answer from you. Mine was, what may make a difference for me. I don't think it would ever happen, but if he actually apologized for what he did on January 6th at the end of the election, if he told us, hey, you know what, I did some things during my last 4 years that I made a mistake on. Certainly one of them was what happened on January 6th. Even if he didn't intend for it to happen, if he took responsibility for what did happen, his role in it, that would tell me that maybe the Trump that in my mind is someone who is uncontrollable and narcissistic and that cannot deal with any self-responsibility, that he is the victim in chief. That would tell me that my perception of him maybe was wrong. Bob, anything either one of them could say, good or bad, that might change your mind in terms of how you're going to vote?
I don't think so. I mean, Trump semi-apologized at the time of shortly after January 6th and instantly started walking it back. And now he celebrates them as patriots and pledges to pardon all of them. Joe Biden ran as a return to normal in our politics and sort of an after Trump tonic. And then governed as a sharply progressive, big spending liberal. I don't think that there's anything he could say that would persuade me that he would conduct himself in a different fashion in a second term. He had that opportunity, I think, with the State of the Union address. If he had, at the start of the campaign, suggested that he would be what he ran as in 2020, that might have changed my opinion. If he said he was going to be more like a small ball liberal Bill Clinton president and recognize that we have divided government and just try to fix our problems in a pragmatic way, that might have opened my mind. At this point, it would just sound like a political tactic to me.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Bill Clinton, I think he's one of the smartest politicians that I had met, and I met a number of people who were president. There were two things that he did that really stuck out to me. The first one was the soldier sister moment, the idea that he attacked the rap singer for making incendiary remarks in her lyrics about killing people. And the second thing that he did was the minute he lost that re-election, he beat Newt Gingrich to the stand to say the era of big government is over. And, there are still some people who hold that against him on the left, but it was ingenious because he captured that center ground in that debate, and it made a huge difference. I agree with you that Joe Biden, even when he is his most capable or was his most capable, he's not that person.
Yeah, I think to return to my previous theme, all three of us are kind of policy nerds. I guess we want to hear some ideas for after 2024 for some of the problems that the country and the world face. I don't think we're going to hear any of that stuff, so I don't see how I can be swayed one way or the other by a debate that's going to essentially consist of canned talking points and ad hominem attacks. If we see anything different, I'll be honestly very surprised. To be honest, I'll be surprised if I don't change the channel. I was just talking to a friend and he told me that the USA is playing some obscure South American country. I don't even remember which one, in the soccer. And, USA is not very good at soccer, but maybe even that's more interesting than the presidential debate.
I think you just insulted us again. This New Zealander stuff is starting to get to me.
The problem is, Paul, they're having the Euro and the American Cup at the same time. And if you watch like Spain play Portugal or something, or France, Netherlands, and then you switch it over to America versus Panama or something, it's not a fair comparison.
Panama's a tough team. I'm just going to put that out there. So, all right. Here's what I want to flip to. Now, I want to flip to, we have three major pieces that came out in the last 2 weeks that are talking about an American apocalypse. I mean, they are literally almost talking about the end. These pieces are all long pieces. We'll put them up on the screen so that people can see each one of them. But for the most part, they're all very respected writers. One on the far left, one more on the far right, and one who's maybe, I don't know if he's center right or center left. But Neil Ferguson is the first one. And Neil Ferguson wrote a piece about the Soviet Union. And what he really did is he said, maybe in this Cold War, Neil has been advocating for some period of time that we are in fact in a Cold War and that we have to recognize that. But the piece that he wrote the other day said, maybe we are the Soviet Union. And he meant that, I think, in a variety of ways, but one of them was we outboxed the Soviet Union. We combined with China, and we were able to outbox them. I know he meant it in other ways as well. Again, it's a very long piece, but you'll see everything from the attitude of Americans are being overweight of a wide variety of things where he began to pin us as being in that quarter. The second one was in the Atlantic. At the end of this program, I'm going to do a piece on it, but it slammed Phoenix in a variety of ways. It slammed us on our water, on our heat, on Rusty Bowers, on being the MAGA capital of the world. I mean, they made a whole wide variety of insinuations. But what he was really saying was, this is the future, that Phoenix, what's happening here is really what's happening around the country. And that it was apocalyptic. It was this view of, we're not going to make it. And then finally, we have Ray Dalio. Now, Ray Dalio did his piece, and in that one, it was stark because Ray has been for a while writing about the cycles that happen in economics, and it's fascinating. I've read almost all of his books. He's a very bright guy. He's one of the biggest and maybe most successful fund managers in the world. I think he has the largest fund of anyone else in the world. Literally, government leaders talk to him about how the economic engine works, and they take advice from him on it. And some of his stuff has been very good. But this one said, hey, we're not going to have a civil war. We're in one, and you have to choose. You're going to have to either pick a side or figure your way out. It was stark, and it was dramatic. Now, I have a hard time with any of them, or with all three of those points of view. We'll talk about that. But Henry, let's start with Neil Ferguson's piece. You sent that to me. And again, I've watched many, many Neil Ferguson podcasts. I really like him. I love his view of history. Certainly there are things I don't agree with him on, but he is a very, very sharp guy. Talk to us, if you can, about his particular piece and what you think he was advocating.
Right. So the title of the piece was "Are We All Soviets Now?" And he was making the argument, as you said, that essentially the US is the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And I guess China is the US in the 1980s, meaning that the two countries are locked in a struggle, but the US is going to lose. And he rallies a lot of different data points to try and support this. Things like declining life expectancy for males, increasing rates of drug abuse, the increasing age and sort of mental incapacity of our political leaders. And these things were all happening in the late 1980s in the Soviet Union. And he argues they're happening today. And that therefore the United States is on this track towards some sort of terrible end, sort of like the Soviet Union experienced in the early 1990s when the whole country fell apart, its economy fell apart. They had this terrible, terrible economic crisis, and all these bad things went along with it. And I think that, I mean, I'm an admirer of Neil Ferguson as well. I love listening to him talk on his podcasts, and I've enjoyed several of his books. But he's taken this really dark turn recently that I can't sort of join him on the ride, I have to say. And I think that the fundamental problem with his analysis is that in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, all the Soviet Union's problems were the inherent result of the Soviet system. So the Soviet system, the economy is intrinsically very inefficient because it's a planned economy and huge government ownership. So yes, they were poor and they couldn't keep up with the US in the arms race, and they couldn't have enough food to feed people. There were shortages and queuing, etc. The political system led to the decrepitude of its political leaders because it was a totalitarian dictatorship. You had to rise through the ranks of the Communist Party. There was no way for outsiders or young people to enter the system. It was a natural result of the Soviet system. Any problems that the United States is experiencing today, and the United States has a lot of problems today, we talk about them on the show a lot, but they are sort of the small patches of problems in a system that otherwise works pretty well. I mean, yes, we have increasing mortality in some groups, especially older working class men, is my understanding. But I would say that is not a function of the American political economy as such. It's a sort of an area where things aren't working properly. The whole system, the capitalist democratic system as a whole, isn't failing. There are certain patches of it that aren't working properly, and there are ways that we can solve that through our democratic policy-making process. And I'd say the same thing about our two leaders that are going to go up on the debate tonight. the fact that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are the two people running for president is not an intrinsic function of our political system that tends to overall generate older leaders. In fact, we have a lot of really young people in Congress. We have relatively young leadership here in Arizona, for example. And if you look in Europe, they've got extremely young political leaders coming up, the new generation. So the I think Ferguson's getting the story all wrong. The Soviet Union system was bad, and therefore it generated bad results. The American system is overall good. It sometimes generates suboptimal results, but we can fix those problems. Whereas the Soviet Union system, it was doomed to collapse.
I don't accept the idea that that the Cold War with the Soviet Union is a good analog to our geopolitical competition currently with China and to a lesser degree Russia, North Korea, Iran. I do believe that there is a geopolitical competition between democratic capitalism and authoritarianism. And what is mostly happening on the authoritarian side is an attempt to reduce the stigma that the Western set of values attaches to their form of government. To make the world safe for autocrats is basically their objective. And I don't believe that China has the same intent that the Soviet Union did to spread its political economy, its method of government, throughout the world. I don't think you have that comprehensive clash. It's a different kind of competition. And I don't think there's any reason to bet on China rather than the United States and other Western-style democracies. I believe that China faces the difficulty of transitioning between what they've been able to achieve as an export-driven economy to the next level of rising living standards for their people, which is more of a consumer-oriented economy, which in other parts of the world, such as Taiwan, South Korea, has coincided with more of a democratic form of government. And they have the problem of an aging population, and they continue to have a per capita income approximately a fourth that of the United States. So the adage that they're going to get old before they get rich is certainly true. And I agree with everything Henry said about the difference between the intrinsic failures of the Soviet system and the problems that occur within our system. I do believe that our political process has, and we can deal with this in some of the other articles that we're going to be discussing, but I do believe that our political system is creating less than optimal choices in terms of our political leadership and empowering extreme views on the left and the right disproportionately to their true representation within the body politic.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. There is a difference between what's happening in our political system and what is happening both in the private sector and in private life. Our American political system, there are extremes that are at play, and it's partly because of the system itself. But I don't know about you. I have friends on the right and on the left, and friends on the right and the left that are friends with one another. I don't see those divisions being nearly as big in private life as I see them being on CNN or Fox News and on watching the nightly news. I also think that what this misses is, you have to think about, to what end was Neil trying to get to? Is he just trying to give us a warning? Is he just concerned about the direction that he sees us going in? Or does he actually believe that there's a possibility that somehow or another we end up being like the Soviet Union? Henry, what are your thoughts on that?
It's hard to read the guy's mind. I mean, he has a very dark view on American politics, American culture, American higher education. He has a very dark view on the state of higher education, and he thinks the universities are irredeemably politically biased and have all these issues. And yet, Neil Ferguson has led an incredibly charmed life. My understanding is he came from a middle class family in Scotland and got a good education in Oxford and became a professor at Harvard and a fellow at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. I mean, he's lived probably his dream life, and he flies all around the world giving talks and is feted by audiences all around. I honestly, personally, don't really understand why he is so upset about these things and whether this is just something that resonates with him and his audiences and he's ringing an alarm bell, or whether he really thinks that some sort of grand calamity is coming. He's very intelligent, astute, an analyst of history. I find it hard to believe that he would have had such a lack of proportion and perspective that he would really think that we're headed towards some sort of civilizational collapse. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he really does believe that.
All right. So, Bob, on the question I would ask you, you spent a lot of time studying the political system and watching the political system. My question is it helpful? You know, I know that a pessimist oftentimes helps us in that they tell us what our problems are and then we rise up to try to fix it. And I think the optimist benefit is that the only people who are going to solve problems are people who believe that you can solve them. So the optimist is necessary in that. But if you were looking at the political system, do these types of analogies that talk about us being the Soviet Union and a societal collapse, do you see that as being beneficial or harmful?
I think harmful because they are so divorced from reality and the true choices that we ought to be making that they lead the conversation nowhere. I find very little in what he had to say that leads us in any direction, in part because it's, in my judgment, divorced from reality. We're not in any way resembling the Soviet Union. And I personally don't think that there's that in terms of the intermediate term over the next 15 to 25 years, that we're going to see China continue to advance vis-a-vis the United States. I think they're close to reaching peak without fairly substantial substantive changes to their own political economy. Their political economy doesn't work. Ours does, if we can keep it.
Yeah. You know, it's, I've used this dinner more than once. I had a chance to have almost a private dinner with Ronald Reagan. I got to speak to him for about an hour and a half at the end of his career, right when I had just become mayor. And I remember asking him what was the single most important thing. And this has always stuck out to me. He said, look, no matter what you do, people are always going to be pointing out the problems. There are all types of experts who are going to tell you what the problems are. And there are all types of advocates and interest groups who make money from telling you what the problems are. He says, and they're telling them to the public also. He said, remember, it's your job to leave people with hope. And I think there's something to that. I don't think we have either of the two people running for president today that are going to leave us with a lot of hope. When you look at Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, I mean, the great leaders left us not with the sense that it was easy, that we didn't have to work to be successful, but that we could get there. So I'm going to use this as a transition to Ray Dalio's piece. Now, Ray has been doing pieces for a number of years. I encourage anyone, if you get a chance, to watch online what he calls the economic machine. Watch it. It's a 30-minute video. It's done very simplistically, but he talks about how markets work and how there are debt cycles. There are short-term debt cycles, long-term debt cycles, and that a lot of what we have happen becomes part of those debt cycles. And he talks about how if you take on too much debt, it can give rise to the isms, the communisms, the fascism, and that you need to be careful on. It literally is one of the best pieces I've seen that combined economics and politics together. But his latest venture has been to be talking about the cycles of governments and the cycles of empires. And he likes to talk about what happened with England and with the Dutch Empire, as well as a variety of others. And he's very good at it. I think he really has done a lot of study. But his view is that we're on the way down and that China's on the way up. Now, I love our economist, Elliot Pollock, who says, look, our dollar, we're in big trouble, and we'd be in really big trouble if it weren't for everybody else's currency that's so bad. All right, it's who do you compare it to that matters. What I think that Ray has clearly been proven wrong on has been the rise of China. In fact, I think that is moving in the opposite direction. But his latest piece says we are headed for a civil war. No, I take it back. If you read it, and we'll put it up here so people can read it for themselves, he's saying we are in a civil war. Now, he says that may not turn violent, but it is nonetheless a civil war where the two sides do not want to work with one another. They do not want to, they're not going to support either one in the election process, and that eventually that breaks down into violence. Bob, I'm going to give you first crack at that and give me kind of your analysis of how you see that.
I think it's the distorted nature of partisan primaries that create the illusion that that's where we are as a country. Because you have sharply progressive people on the left and the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party on the right. And that tends to be our choice these days. But I think there's a good solid 35 to 40% of the body politic who hunger for pragmatic problem-solving leadership. The problem is that people who are in that mode have a difficult time getting to the general election with the current configuration of our two political parties. And I think if we created opportunities for those kind of people to reach the general election, that they would tend to win fairly easily against either the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. We've seen that in Arizona, where all the Democrats have to do running against a MAGA candidate is to have someone who at least seems to be reasonable and sensible and not crazy. So I think that it's that we have an illusion of a more sharply divided body politic than is actually the case. And while I am deeply fearful that irrespective of the outcome of the presidential election, that there will be political violence, what we're going through today just pales when you consider what we went through as a country in the 1960s. We had political assassinations, we had race riots, we had violent protests against the Vietnam War. I mean, if you were to say that that was a time since the Civil War when there was the greatest stress among being a united people, it was in the 1960s. This is nothing compared to that.
Yeah, I read that piece as well, and I thought that he was a little fast and loose with his concepts. This is my political science training coming through, and the term civil war to me is inherently implies violence and violence on a very large scale. And I don't think he really actually in the end thinks that's what's going to happen. And so I think what he's really talking about is political polarization, which I think he's right. It's already happened, and I think it's increasing, and that's a concern. And on the other hand, potential social disorder, and this is something that Bob pointed to, is that there can be mobilization, right? If people don't believe that the constitutional system and the democratic system is getting the outcomes they need, there can be mobilization extra constitutionally, mass mobilization that can turn violent. And personally, I think that we did experience a large scale wave of mass mobilization that began in 2015 when Trump ran for president, and it continued all the way through the George Floyd riots in 2020. I don't think that there was really a halt in mobilization by different political causes during that period. I think it's ebbed, but we saw with the campus protests that there's still potential for that around the country today. So I agree with Dalio and with with Bob that there is potential for political mobilization that can turn violent, but I don't think that there's a danger of a civil war and that the actual constitution and the political regime is threatened in any way. And the simple reason for that is that the United States has the most powerful military on the planet, and regardless of how much internal dissent there is against the regime, it will always be able to be relatively swiftly and effectively dealt with by the many different levels of policing and National Guard and military that we have in this country. So I agree with them that polarization is at a point where there's not going to be much cooperation in the foreseeable future. That'll lead to political gridlock and dysfunction. That will probably also lead to dissatisfaction and mobilization with potentially sporadic violence, but I do not in the slightest think that there's going to be any large scale violence that you could start to approach to call a civil war.
So there's a great book that was written by a pollster, and it was a man and a woman. I believe they're married. In fact, I'm positive they were married. But they began to poll a question that has been used to show how divided the United States was. And it's this question of, all right, if you would you oppose your son or your daughter marrying a person if you knew they were a Trump supporter? And then the other question is, would you oppose your son marrying a woman if you knew that they were a Hillary Clinton supporter? And so they show how like 80% of the public on both sides would be opposed to a marriage where they married across the political aisle. So what the pollster did is they tore that question apart. They said, okay, well, let's start with this. Ask the next question. Right? If you knew that the person was a Trump supporter, but they were a hard worker and they were a family person, they took care of the kids, but they were a Trump supporter, how would you feel about it? Well, the number flips by itself, right? If you ask them about a woman who was a Hillary supporter, but you knew she was a good mom and she was decent, she really loved your son, how would you feel about it? So the question itself jigs the answer. But what he also pointed out, or they pointed out, was that the people that were being polled were only those people who were high efficacy voters in the Democratic primary and high efficacy voters in the Republican primary. Well, when you do those numbers, you're talking about 6 to 8% of the public. Now, I could run through the math with you, but I'm telling you, it's at most 10% of the public. So that group of people, 2 out of 10, they may be extremely divided. They may be at the issue where they literally would judge their son-in-law or daughter-in-law by who they support for president. But that's not true with the other 8 out of 10 Americans. All you have to do is look at your personal life and think about your friends. And we all have that friend on one issue or the other who is demented when it comes to the political race. They're just so far off, you can't even talk to them because of how extreme they are on the issue. But the reality is the rest of our society, we're not even close. And we're not close because this is still the greatest superpower in the history of the planet. We've not only done more to advance human progress than anyone else, but we've done more to help ourselves. There's still a great chance to succeed. So my question to both of you on this is, do you believe that if either one of these presidential candidates win, that it means the end to the United States of America, that we end in a civil war?
No, but I do believe that there is danger from a second Trump presidency of a more vigorous attack on constitutional foundations than occurred towards the end of his first term. So our constitutional guideposts were severely tested. And I ask people who think that it wasn't a near-run thing to just contemplate what would have happened in this country if Mike Pence had said yes to Donald Trump rather than no to Donald Trump. I think that would have been a nightmarish scenario. I think whoever the Trump's vice president is this time won't say no to Trump. being willing to say no, I think, is a prerequisite for having the job. And there were a variety of other people who he attracted to his first administration that acted in part as a barrier or a check. And it's not certain that those kind of people will be asked, or if asked, would accept in a second Trump term. So I do believe that there are legitimate concerns about the testing of our system that a second Trump term would represent. There is testing of our political economy in a second Biden term, but not of our constitutional structure.
Yeah, it's John McCain said to me John McCain was certainly was not a big fan of Trump, and Trump obviously wasn't a fan of his. But he pointed out to me in the beginning of his term, he appointed one of the best cabinets he'd ever seen, that they were a highly qualified group of people. And then incrementally, he began to tear that apart. He began to look for people who would just do what it was that he wanted them to do. I think we'll be tested. I don't have any doubt about that. And I think that there are real dangers to him being elected. But I really believe in our institutions. I believe at the end of the day, we survive even that because the United States of America is just quite simply bigger than him.
I agree. I'm a little more optimistic on the ability of the institutions and the checks and balances to hold in the United States, especially because they are decentralized across a federal system, which gives it such incredible resilience. But one thing I'm really interested in is whether we can even recognize our partisan politics over the next 4 or 5 years. I do think there's a big realignment taking place with the white working class and actually working classes of all ethnicities shifting to the right, more broad-based shift against immigration and globalization. And I do think that the Republican Party has responded more to that shift so far than the Democratic Party. And I'm going to be very interested to watch if Joe Biden loses to Trump in November, whether that sets off some kind of a landslide of political recalibration within the Democratic Party, whether they lurch to the left, to the progressive left, or whether they make some other much more interesting type of a shift to try and recapture those working class voters that have taken on a more nationalist, globalization skeptical approach and are drifting to the Republican Party. So I think that the institutions will probably hold, but the positions, the sort of politicians and the sort of positions they're advocating in the different parties might appear very strange to us from today's perspective in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, the Republican Party has made a significant shift under Donald Trump. I think it's incumbent. I don't know that the Democratic Party can reform itself. I have this fundamental belief that as long as we have these partisan systems, that in the end, they're going to go back to try to appeal to their extreme. I think it's challenging to get them to do anything different. But I'm positive as we're pushing this reform in Arizona to try to open up the primaries, there are a lot of people who are deeply concerned on the right and the left about an illiberal society that is beginning to emerge on the right and the left, or the desire for a more illiberal society. I think we should study what is happening with Donald Trump to try to figure out what is happening. When I talk to a lot of people, again, there are a number of people who they pick their candidate and then they decide their issues. But when you try to get through the fundamentals of it, it's not lost on me. I mean, I would say in general, I was a supporter of the Me Too movement. I like the idea that that women should speak up immediately when someone in any way harms them or harasses them or puts them in a bad position. I don't like the idea that you do it 30 years later, but I think that learning to speak up is important. But you also have to recognize that there are losses from that, meaning if you get rid of that scale of justice where you're trying to weigh out what really happened in a situation, you just say, no, because you're a male, you're a bad guy. What I've learned in being an employer is there's lots of nuances to every single issue that you have to get through the details before you can really figure out what happened. But the point I'm giving is, if you continue to move that group of people out and you say, you guys are the bad guys, men are the bad guys, you're not going to have a fair chance to be able to have a saying. And if you do speak up and you say anything different, we're going to ostracize you. You're going to lose your job. You may lose your position in society. You may lose your professorship. That becomes a problem. And the only way you solve that problem is by allowing more people to speak and to talk about the issues and to find some common ground in it. To me, what the Trump candidacy is important for us to look at is that how the massive amount of social change that's happening, and that's happening very fast, can have a very negative effect on your political environment. And I'll let you guys both comment on that, and then we'll move to the last article.
There is one small optimistic note, I think, which is that in this election cycle, there are in Republican primaries some more moderate, pragmatic conservatives winning despite Trump endorsing one of their opponents. So I do think that Trump's ironclad grasp on Republican nominees all across the country has relaxed, and that the Republican electorate in various races are being a little bit more pragmatic in their own choices.
Been watching developments in Europe relatively closely. I lived in Europe for a long time, and what's really striking over there is you've had new parties crop up, like Macron's party, and then his party now seems to be totally sort of going under, more or less, under pressure from the left and the right. In Britain, the Tories are having a terrible time. They're going to have an election in a couple of months, I believe, maybe even less. And there's a new right-wing party sprung up under Nigel Farage called Reform that some people are saying, and it's a crazy thought, but they're saying that the Tory party could sort of implode and Reform might replace the Tory party, or maybe Nigel Farage will become the new leader of the Tory party. It makes me wonder whether similar things could happen in other countries, including the United States. And it's very unlikely because of the primary system and the two-party system and all these things. But that's what makes me wonder whether something kind of radical could happen in this realignment of the parties that we're seeing. And it could be that the Democratic Party is completely unrecognizable, or the Republican Party, either could be completely unrecognizable from the way they look today, because politics are just more in flux today than they have been since, I think, the end of the Second World War when it comes to the party systems.
All right, so let's go to this article in The Atlantic. When you read the title, it's like the all-American city. It looks like it's a puff piece for Phoenix, but by the time you get done, it's a hit job. I have said to both of you, I've been through this before. I was mayor during the period of time that the Barron's article came out. I always thought that it was like bad luck. I became mayor, and like a few months later, the Barron articles comes out that says Boomtown goes bust. But East Coast press loves to beat up on Phoenix. There are some issues in there that I think are worthy of spending some time on. The water issue is one that I may spend an entire show on, because I think that water is always important. Although, if you look at the history of Arizona, there is no better state at being able to deal with the water issues than Arizona has been. We have been very good at that in our past. And I think sometimes, while you shouldn't take that for granted, I think we will find a way to be able to solve the challenges that we face. In fact, I'm positive we will. But there were other things that they pointed out that I thought were important for us to deal with. And so I'm going to kind of go through them just one at a time here. Henry, I know your children are in charter schools. One of the attacks was how charter schools is kind of a big negative for Arizona, the amount of money that we've diverted off into that area and the challenges it's created. I'd love to have your thoughts on that, especially I believe your wife works with one of the charter schools.
Yeah, the narrative on the charter schools in the Atlantic piece was a little bit mixed, because he was actually praising a Hispanic family from Phoenix whose daughter was really excelling in one of the charter schools in Phoenix, but the tone was not one of celebrating the student's success, but sort of saying what a shame that happened in a charter school rather than in a public school, which I guess somehow would be better. But the reality is that the school choice movement and the charter schools have been a huge success in Phoenix, and not only in Phoenix, but in the rest of the state as well. And they've been a success nationwide. You know, the most recent research, or the best research out of Stanford on this issue, showed that charter schools are generating significantly better results for students, even when you control for the income of the students and their racial and socioeconomic background, which is one of the main critiques of charter schools, that they kind of cherry pick the best students, leaving all the others for the district schools. So I thought the piece was a little incoherent, actually, to praise the success of this one young girl, but at the same time just to sort of say that it was not legitimate because it had occurred in a charter school. It didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Bob, in the past, you wrote an article a long time ago that had a big effect on how I saw education. You pointed out that in education, if you adjust for children who speak English as a second language, it really begins to have a dramatic effect on where we are in terms of our spending versus our ranking. Again, on the charter schools, I believe you've been a supporter, but I'd love your thought on the educational issue.
Like Henry, I found the whole piece confusing. It sort of reminded me of Winston Churchill's complaint that there's no theme to this pudding. Just to the extent it had a point, I think it was that our toxic politics may not allow us to solve our water problem, and that's somehow a metaphor for the future of the whole country. But on education, Arizona schools have always gotten a bum rap. If you disaggregate student groups and compare like students to like students, our performance on national tests have been at or above the national average. And if you look at charter students as a whole, they actually are some of the highest performing in terms of test scores on the nationally administered test in the entire country. And while I am willing to accept that our schools could use additional funding, at one point in time, one of the originators of one of our major charter schools told me that they were running on fumes, and I would rather have schools not having to run on fumes. But public education in Arizona is much better than generally given credit for, and additional money isn't always the answer. And the use of this one family, where his problem seemed to be that the charter system hadn't welcomed necessarily transgendered kids, and he did, but had a classical education. So his dilemma was, well, can't we have both? Well, yeah, there are plenty of charter schools in which transgendered kids are openly accepted. My son taught at one. So the whole idea of school choice is that you find the fit that's best for the kid. And in Arizona, it has worked.
All right. Do you think I agree with you on the big theme? He talked about heat. He talked about water. It was really difficult to figure out what his point was, other than maybe a couple of month vacation in Phoenix, which is a great place to vacation if you come from New York. But it seems like the point he was trying to make was our political system is a wreck. We've been overrun by MAGA extremists, and that I would guess that means that we're doing much worse than the rest of the nation in terms of our politics. Now, you and I, maybe all three of us, have been supporters of reform, and I'm a big supporter of political reform. But I'm not altogether sure I buy into the idea that Arizona is worse than anyone else on this topic.
Well, I do think our Republican Party has been more thoroughly captured by the worst parts of the MAGA movement, but they've been punished electorally for that. They've lost every important statewide office. And his point, to the extent I could gather one, was that our toxic politics will make it difficult for us to, or impossible for us to solve our water problem. And we're going to dry up and blow away. And that's a metaphor somehow for the future of the entire country. The irony of this is that despite the toxicity of our politics, water is the one subject on which there is still productive bipartisan discussions going on. They didn't yield agreement in time to be enacted in the last legislative session, but there was meaningful progress made, and both sides say so. So paradoxically, where he said our toxic politics might cause our existential extinction, is one area where, despite what's happened to the Republican Party, there's still highly productive discussions and negotiations going on.
All right. I put together a little video and we'll get some comments after that. Let's put up the slides here. So what I did, obviously this guy took on Phoenix. I used to be the mayor of Phoenix, so I can't help myself but feeling a little more defensive than them. But this promo piece that he did, in my opinion, was just really a hit job. You can read it in The Atlantic. The Atlantic is a little more of a left-leaning group, but they're also kind of a defender of New York. And if you really want to know what it is that that this author in Atlantic is doing, is they're really worried, not about what's happening in Phoenix, they're worried about what's happening in New York. Now, in New York, one of the great places that we love in Phoenix is New York, because a lot of people leave New York and move to Phoenix. But if you look at a latest poll that was done by Newsweek, it talks about there being millions of New Yorkers who may be planning to leave. In fact, 7.5 million New Yorkers plan to leave the state. That is 37% of all New Yorkers. 48% of those are Republicans. That one I might have guessed. The one that surprised me, though, is this next one, which is that's 29% of the Democrats. So we decided in the Optimistic American, being they sent a reporter here, the Optimistic American sent me there. I'm not really a reporter. I probably should have sent Bob. But nonetheless, we've had kind of a lot of fun with New York over the years. In fact, one of my favorite times with New York is when the Phoenix Suns played the Knicks, although most of the New Yorkers that live here call them the Knocks because they're constantly getting knocked out of the playoffs, so it's been upsetting to them for many, many decades. But nonetheless, it is a little bit more than a game on this one, so we decided to take this on. Now, here's the key. You cannot look at anything without comparing it to something else, right? And so if you just look at Phoenix and absentia, you come up with criticism. You can do that in any city in the country, but you need to compare it to other places. So what I did is I did a comparison to New York. So the question is, why are people leaving New York? Now, the first one is, my observation would be, they're leaving New York because of the heat. The heat's really bad in New York. When I was there, I heard about how bad the heat was here. I hit the heat wave. It was incredibly hot. It was like 95 degrees. The water that's coming out of that spigot, it could have been the precipitation and the humidity that was there. I mean, it was unbelievably hot. Of course, they were also very concerned, or the author was very concerned, about how the heat has an effect on the homeless in Phoenix. Now, the homeless is a serious issue. I spent many, many years working on the homeless issue, so I don't want to play that down any. But when you go to New York, one of the things that you will see is that New Yorkers have a lot of homeless, but they go down into the subways, because in the subways, they actually can sometimes get air conditioning. But there, the homeless has something different to worry about. You'll see in this video here in a second that we put up.
Only in New York City Transit.
As you come up to that blanket, you can see the guy's foot. He's one of the homeless guys sleeping there. This was posted actually on TikTok. But when you get to the inn there, that blanket starts to lift up and outrun 100 rats.
That's what I figured it was going to be.
If you want to know why, here it is, right? This is their sanitation department at work. There's garbage everywhere. They're in plastic bags out on the street. The bags are ripped, and you will find rats constantly when you're walking down the street coming out of their garbage. The garbage is ripped apart. It's put out in plastic. And then, of course, you end up having the union problems that New York has. And so oftentimes they can't get their garbage department out there to pick it up for whatever reason, besides the fact that it's really hot there. And what that ends up resulting in are streets that are a mess. Now, what that's done is it's created this really cool little thing. This is actually in the New York newspapers that you will find. It's created New York vigilante rat hunters. You can see the rats that are hanging. It's really just a sweet thing to see as you're walking underneath one of these freeways and they're hanging there that they've been killed. They've got the dogs and all of them laid out in advance, but it's the version of hunting that they have in New York. Now, observation number 2, they're deeply concerned about businesses moving to Arizona. Certainly, we've had some big victories. We were able to get TSMC, the chip manufacturer here. There are a number of subcontractors that are kind of going to come from it, but there are companies that are moving here in mass. Now, if you want to know why, it's really not all that complex to figure out. For the most part, it relates to a society that has a lower tax rate and lower regulation. If you look at this slide, what you'll see is the guy is handcuffed down at the bottom. In Phoenix, we'd call this a picture of the mob. Now, what New York calls it is a picture of the building inspection department. Literally, their newspaper is full of stories of inspectors who took bribes in dealing with complaints or with permits. It happens year after year. Now, what you should recognize is that when you're talking about somebody taking a bribe, what you're really talking about isn't some guy that's getting paid off. It's the idea that other people who are interested in getting a permit or a permit process can't get it done unless they're willing to pay the same price. And if you want to know why, here it is. Look at the amount of regulations in New York versus Arizona. In New York, they are filled with regulations. It's the highest regulated state in the country. Arizona's down there at the bottom. What does that do? Well, the more regulations you have, the more inspectors you have. The more inspectors you have, the higher the chance you have for corruption. Being able to keep regulations under control is an important factor, and New York is at the worst level. He also talked about those Phoenix subdivisions and what it is that the challenges that that's created. Here's what you can buy in Phoenix, right? You can see the home up in the upper right-hand corner, the nice pool, the sunset that you can watch. But for the same price, here's what you can get in New York. You can get a walk up to the 5th floor in an apartment complex, right? So you can see the apartment complex, nice 5 floors that you have to walk up, and then all the fun things that you get to walk through in New York to be able to get there. Here's observation number 3, education. He talked a lot about the idea of charter schools. Now, I'm only going to pick out one school, which is BASIS. I'm a big supporter of Great Hearts and a variety of others. But what you'll see in the STEM ranking is that there are a number of charter schools, of BASIS schools, that have done very, very well in the country for STEM rankings. In this next portion, these are of all schools, of the top 100 schools. And I believe that they evaluated over 25,000 different schools, 18,000 of them in detail. And of the top 100, look how many of those come from Arizona. Now, in New York, you can get the same thing. They have a BASIS school in New York. The BASIS school that's there has a waiting line of people wanting to get in. It's pretty competitive. My son was there. He had to work hard to get his children into BASIS. However, there, the tuition and financial aid costs $43,700 to send them to that school. In Arizona, the tuition cost for BASIS or other charter schools, it's free. It costs you nothing. It's part of what we're able to provide people. You can get your kids into some of the best schools in the country, literally at no cost. Now, in free speech ranking, which is openness, tolerance for others, openness to speakers, the best schools in the country, 84th is the University of Arizona. 77th is Arizona State University. 16th was Northern Arizona University. Now, if you go to the worst, 214th was Columbia. 224th was New York University. 224th is Fordham University. Now, I put in the 234th here for Yale University, only because the guy who wrote the article went to Yale. We have 30,000 enrolled engineers, and that includes engineers that are involved in AI technology, all the way to trying to figure out a way to get people to Mars. New York campuses, they're schools of radical ideologies, and you don't have to take that from me. Just watch your television set. You'll see this on kind of a regular basis. So the big question is, what are you teaching them? I mean, queers for Palestine, gays believing that somehow or another that Palestine is a better place for them than than Israel or the United States. The real issue that we should be teaching them is about the gender apartheid that is taking place in the Middle East, and again, not in Israel. About what that means to women who are forced to wear burqas that they don't want to wear. Here, it's just simply the idea that there are women who are being oppressed. And if you put a real focus on history and you really talk about what's happening around the world, you will find that what is happening here and in places like Israel is dramatically better than what you're going to find in a place like Gaza. Now, Senator Rusty Bowers was defeated, and we're very proud of Rusty Bowers. Rusty was he was a Republican who was Speaker of the House, but he was given the JFK Profiles in Courage Award because he was willing to withstand a tremendous amount of political heat to not overturn the election. Now, that cost him his job. It cost him his job because there were Republicans in the Republican primary that were mad at him. The author wanted to say that this was what caused it. An Arizona MAGA mob. And actually, there are certainly a couple of these people that actually did come from Arizona, although this is certainly happening in Washington, D.C. But if you want to know what really put the pressure on him, were two individuals. These are the two guys who actually worked to beat him. These are the guys that were calling him, putting pressure on him. We call this the New York MAGA mob, right? These are the guys that were calling him to defeat our person. So if you're worried about MAGA, you might want to start in the state of New York to figure out why the MAGA problem exists and not here. So I put together a little agreement. I call it a consulting agreement. I think in New York, they call it a grifter agreement, to try and advise the government of New York as to how it is that they could actually make some improvements that could stop all those people from coming here to Phoenix. So here are my recommendations. Now, you missed the best thing that Phoenix has to offer. As it turns out, you undoubtedly would have missed it if you were analyzing New York. Because the thing that makes New York great, it's your people. If you think a city is great because of its skyline, its weather, or politics, then you miss the point. What makes New York amazing is its diversity and its vibrant population. Your achievements in civil rights, human rights, they're commendable. You've managed to get a lot of different people to live together in very, very tight quarters. They thrive in areas where they have freedom, like art and theater and music. But your people want to be innovative and they want to be creative. But here's the bad news. What you're doing is unsustainable. Sky-high rents, massive taxation, government overspending, they're crippling your city. And despite all of this, you have rats the size of small dogs. We may be hot in Phoenix, but at least we don't have to dodge mountains of trash during garbage strikes. Your streets look like the opening scene of a post-apocalyptic movie. The creative minds who could solve these problems, they've been stifled by heavy regulations. So here's how to fix it. Start with this. Get off their backs. Blow apart your regulatory regimes. Contract out areas where you can create savings. Open up your schools to real competition. Lower your tax rates and quit punishing those people who are successful. Get your universities to hire more professors in engineering and business, science, and history. Hire fewer who focus on these divisive ideologies. Teach about the real impacts of Marxism and communism honestly. And if you're going to teach about the works of Marxism or Edward Said or Franz Fons, then be honest about how communism murdered tens of millions of people in the Great Leap Forward and in the gulags, or the extreme oppression of women and gays in Palestinian states. Debate the theory of Franz Fanon, who said, at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force, and juxtapose that with Martin Luther King, who spoke about not seeing others as part of some group, but instead to judge them by the content of their character. Get rid of regulations like rent controls that stifle supply and empower that incredible free market force that you have centered right there in your city. Somehow or another, New York City's mottos become, if we can't drive you bankrupt, we're not trying hard enough. You keep piling on taxes and red tape, and we'll keep welcoming your fleeing businesses with open arms and sunny skies. While we're lounging by the pool in our backyards, you're stuck in these tiny apartments paying more in rent for parking than we do for mortgages. All those regulations and taxations, you still can't get through a summer without a subway turning into a sauna or the streets looking like a landfill. So start with the simple things. Pick up your damn garbage and see if that doesn't get rid of those rats. You want to get rid of mobsters in your politics? Cut your regulations and reduce the amount of people that you need doing enforcement. Your parks, your open space, your shopping districts, and your theaters, they're amazing. But it's your people that are the most special. Phoenix and New York are both going to find their way because they have amazing people. But you want to know who's really at risk? You are. What the Atlantic did to Phoenix is systematic of why no one trusts the media anymore. A reporter came to Phoenix to try to do harm. We believe that you did that because you're terrified that people and businesses are leaving New York, and you hope to convince your people that Phoenix was some type of living hell while ignoring the problems right outside your front door. But the problem you should really focus on is the problem inside your front door. The ones where a group of elites decide who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. A group of elites who are more concerned about how to create their own view of a better world than they are about giving people information. A place where debate is stifled and where woke is sacrosanct. Nowhere is that more evident than in the New York media publications. It's not just because the New York media pushed for and wrote the stories that resulted in the burden of taxation and regulation. It's because you've moved from being a liberal media to an anti-liberal media, an illiberal media. Once you embraced illiberalism, it was only a matter of time where you would mimic those that you despised the most on the right. You stifle debate inside and outside of your doors. You have to be right about everything, and so you have to shout down any disagreement internally. The stories are clear from many reporters and columnists. If you ain't woke, you ain't staying. You worry about the Republican Party of America losing their principles. Well, I'm an independent, and I worry about you losing yours. You become the publication of the progressive elites. You simply are an echo chamber where illiberal interests can exist to find agreement with their own tribe. We know about the wrongs America has done, but you spend an incredible amount of time talking about a very dark version of America that never really existed. And what chance you had to convince Americans of those ideas that are meritorious, they're lost because you squandered your credibility through becoming the people that you despise the most. It seems that the only hell that exists is the one that you helped create. Now, as an independent, I wish that wasn't so, because we need a robust discussion from all sides, and we need a media that will help facilitate ideas. As an optimist, I have to hope that you'll try and find a better version of yourself, that you'll give up trying to sell us on your view of a better world, and instead go back to giving us the truth, allowing us to decide. So, in any event, my point here is that if you compare us to New York, it doesn't take long to figure out why it is that people are moving here and companies are moving here. There's a lot to be offered in Phoenix. And if this is the future of the country, I think the country ought to be very happy with it, because it means that they're going to have jobs and there's going to be economic progress. But we shouldn't lose sight of why. The why in this, to me, is very clear, which is the amount of regulations, taxation, the inability to deliver basic services that are needed at a local level. Those become paramount to being able to be successful. We're going to be successful at dealing with our water problems and the other issues because we're not as spread out as New York is. We're not in a position where we have an economy and a government that just quite simply isn't sustainable. So I'll leave last comments for Bob and for Henry. Henry, you first.
Paul, I very much enjoyed that promo for Phoenix and Hit on New York. I thought that was great, and I totally agree. And the title of the piece was correct. The U.S. population is moving to the southwest. It has been for decades, maybe even since the nation's founding, and I think that move is accelerating. So as that happens, despite the heat, despite the supposed water problems, I think that this particular author is just going to be proven wrong with every passing year.
Arizona, and particularly the Phoenix metro area's defining characteristic has been opportunity. And that opportunity is protected by the things that you described, Paul. Reasonable taxation, reasonable regulation, and as your slideshow illustrated, honest government. Those are our virtues. They aren't a promised birthright. It's something that we need to constantly remind ourselves that that's why people move here. That's why we have opportunity, and to work hard to preserve them. And I also think that we have been distinguished in the past by problem-solving, pragmatic leadership within our government. I do think that we are at risk of slipping on that particular measure. And we shouldn't take what we have for granted, but it is fun periodically to say, take that, New York. Although I'm not sure the Phoenix Suns, New York Knicks comparison works as much anymore.
Yeah, well, they have been kicked out of they haven't made the playoffs for, I forget how many it was, 15 out of 20 years they've missed being able to make it to the playoffs. I'm going to be a Suns fan. Literally, it was the only sports team that we had in Arizona when I was growing up. It took us a while before it was the Suns or ASU. Those were the two teams that you could go watch. I remember Frank Cush was our coach back during those years when I was in grade school and high school. To me, the key is you always have to compare it, right? We have to compare Phoenix to New York to figure out, is Phoenix really a good place to be? We should also compare Phoenix to Dallas and Phoenix to LA, and they should compare themselves to us. We should look at what we can do better and not worse. And if you want to figure out if it's working, just ask yourself this question: are people going there? Because if people are going there, that's a big sign that it's working. The same is true with the United States. Where does money want to go, and where do people want to go? Larry Summers made that comment to me. He said, as long as those two things stay in our favor, you know that the United States is in great shape. There's nobody rushing to get into China or Russia. It's just not happening. This is still the place that people from all over the world want to go. I think one of our advantages is that we have 50 states, because it kind of forces all of us to look at what's going on in our area and to figure out how we can do better. I agree with you, Bob. The way that we've been able to maintain that, though, has been through keeping a smaller size government, having less regulations, lower taxation, and still trying to do the job that needs to be done on things like education and the environment, water, and other issues. Just
maybe something like the Atlantic article, I think this was partially true of the Barron's article as well, can serve to remind us of what we have and do a better job of protecting it. I continue to be worried about our ability to maintain the kind of political leadership that the state has enjoyed for most of its history.
I agree.
Apparently one of the problems with this podcast was we all agree with each other too much. And I think this is definitely going to be one of the low points of the podcast from that perspective. We need to fight more. That's what people want to see.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Yep. Well, we'll figure out how to get a fight, especially, Henry, if you get this next book going where you're going to be interviewing, hopefully, people that will come on the podcast. That'd be a blast. You want to tell people about your new book coming up, or the one you're trying to focus on right now?
Well, I'm trying to write a book about the rise of the radical right in Arizona, and I'm hoping that we can have people on the podcast who can talk about that and help me with my research and build some buzz for the book. And we got two good people to talk about that right here. So more to come.
All right. Thanks, guys.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.